Howdy, all you delicious people. So, we have another episode of WandaVision. I didn't know. I just kind of heard on through the grapevine because I was uploading photos onto Facebook to go for thumbnails for today. Like, people were talking and ultimately saying, hey, yeah, guys, check out the midnight airing of the WandaVision season series finale, whatever. And I was like, okay, great. So I'm gonna get another thing to review for today, which ultimately I was just gonna go and just review both coming to America movies and then call it a day. But then ultimately this dropped, so I'm like, well, I guess I'll review this too. Might as well. And ultimately, there's no way that I'm not gonna not save either one of those things and also this to do. So it's just gonna be 3 videos on this channel today. So that's fine. This one's probably a lot easier to review than either one of the Coming to America movies. So, WandaVision, Episode 9. Sure, why not? So, ultimately, luckily, I didn't label anything to be a series or season finale or whatever. I just basically did it as, like, okay, here's Episode 8, whoop-de-doo. This last episode felt so formulaic or just so like it kind of felt like this episode was just like, oh, okay, of course this is going to absolutely go every single one of these ways. There was nothing about this that I felt, oh wow, they're really pulling out something interesting. Wow, they're really pulling out something different. Like, dude, you could watch the tail end of the movie Hulk and like it kind of feels like the same thing in a lot of instances. But I guess this episode, out of all the others, is really a better episode than any of the other episodes, just because it has to be. It has to be because it's the last episode. Reasonably, I would tell people from here on out for any of these shows, if anybody is going into these thinking, oh my god, what kind of Easter eggs or what kind of big, huge thing is going to be in this show? Oh my god, I can't wait for so and so person to appear. I don't know how many flooding of videos and all kinds of things that ultimately had it to where everybody was saying, oh, Spider-Man is going to show up at the tail end of WandaVision. X-Men are going to show up. Doctor Strange is going to show up. Captain Marvel is going to show up. Blue Marvel is going to show up. 1,200 different other people are all going to show up. Like the entire cast of Avengers Endgame is all going to show up and appear on the. Iron Man is going to show up in the last episode and be. You'll find out that he's like completely different or whatever. The all new, different Iron Man is going to show up in the very last end of this show and whatever. And like, man, did people just make money off of that? Ultimately, just like theorizing and crafting that, like, hey, we're gonna have this big colossal character that's gonna come up at the season finale. Just you wait. And reasonably taking this show and making it overall, to me, this entire show altogether felt like the Captain Marvel movie. That's the equivalent to the show is to the Captain Marvel movie. They're reasonably, it's a lot of hodgepodging or predictable things going on, and ultimately this last episode is not any different. So let's ultimately get this show on the road so we can talk about this last episode. I'm not like I'm not gonna sugarcoat it because this is the last thing. This is the last video. This is it. And then ultimately we're gonna see probably Scarlet and probably Maybe Doctor Strange too. Maybe. Because when looking at it, who knows? Because everybody is buzzing about, like, oh, well, Scarlet Witch will be in this movie, and so person will be in that movie, but they won't. They probably won't. So everybody is, like, probably going to lose their minds about how exactly this finale breaks down, because when looking at it, this finale to me was not finale enough. This finale was not finale enough. It wasn't. It just kind of felt like, okay, well, resolve. Like, it just felt like resolve. I should have just came in here and immediately the credits should have rolled, and I should have been done with this episode in like 5 seconds. Like, as soon as I get into it, roll credits. Hey, this is what's gonna happen with WandaVision towards the tail end of this, and credits. Like, I would have really, like, I probably should have just skipped to the end, to the end credit scenes, and because there's two of them in this episode, and then I think that would have been worth it to just, like, oh, like, yeah, I didn't have to watch that WandaVision show. I just had to watch, like, the tail end of it to just see what happens. If anything, we actually do get some interesting thing that happens to Scarlet in this episode, or Wanda in this episode, but that's about as high as we're gonna get to real, true relevance of this show. So let's go into spoilers if I haven't already. Let's crack this bad boy out. So spoiler time, spoiler time. It's about that time to get into spoil this episode. I hated this show. I just thought it was irrelevant. And ultimately, when Wanda is going to be put into whatever movie she's going to get put into, I'll just basically be like, I didn't need to watch this show. Sadly, it's the only thing on. So, anyways, it's the only thing on. Uh, can't wait for Falcon and Winter Soldier to maybe see what that does. Or maybe the Loki show, to probably be baffled and or confused by that show, because I'm assuming that's what's going to happen. Is I'm going to be like, yeah, there's a lot of weird stuff going on in this show. A lot of weird and wacky stuff. So, spoilers. So, we end up having it to where, on the very cliffhanger of the last episode, we end up having it to where Agatha all along is attacking both Wiccan and Speed, and I'm not even going by IMDb or nothing. I'm just gonna go through anybody and just say, like, okay, that person, because yeah. So we end up having it to where we find out that ultimately Agatha is choking the life out of Scarlet's kids, but then eventually Scarlet's kids end up going free, and we end up having it to where her kids are running off. We end up having it to where ultimately there's we kind of find out to where there's kind of like this back and forth battle with Wanda and Agatha, but eventually we have it to a reasonably that Agatha uses the Westview people against Wanda to ultimately have it to where everybody is coming to her and complaining about that. Ultimately, they should die, or Wanda should let them die, so ultimately they could stop this misery, because ultimately they complain that ultimately they get all of her nightmares. They complain because they come out of their performance boxes and be who they actually are, and so we end up having it to where reasonably everybody is talking all at the same time, to ultimately say, like, hey, tell my son I love him, or tell my uncle I love him, or tell whatever family member that isn't in Westview that I love him, and so on and so forth. So everybody's bum rushing Wanda, ultimately complaining about their piddly problems. And so eventually Wanda ends up choking all of them, and we end up having to where Agatha's like, wow, like, I guess a hero ultimately has to, like, subdue and choke out all of the people that she's been torturing for I don't know how long. So we end up having it to where Wanda just wanted to shut them all up. And so we eventually have it to where Wanda ends up wanting to free all the people from Westview. She opens a crack into the Westview box bubble thing and lets everyone out. While letting everyone out, they also let things in. They have it to where ultimately the military makes their way in here. We ultimately have it to where the other Vision makes their way in here, and ultimately Vision and Vision fight it out. Like, I'll go with Vision White and Vision, like like Wanda's Vision will just be called Vision, and Vision White will be the new Vision. So we end up having it to where ultimately Vision and White Vision are ultimately, of course, going to battle it out, and we ultimately have it to where Vision and White Vision end up going into a library of sorts and have like this philosophy ultimately talking about a ship made out of feces. And so we end up having it to where eventually they have this metaphorical talk about feces, and we eventually have it to where Vision ends up giving the White Vision all of his memories. And so I'm like, oh, okay, so here's how they're going to do. Like, they're still going to have Vision, but it's going to be alternative Vision, I guess. Like, it's basically the Star Trek data defense, where we're going to have all the memories in another Vision to ultimately give us still a Vision, but not probably the Vision. So, anyways, moving on. So, we end up having it to where Vision White ultimately says he's like, I am Vision, and then he ends up just flying off. Because we end up finding out that seemingly when Wanda was opening the bubble to get everyone out, or the Nexus, so to say, we end up finding out that what is having it to where everybody's to get out of this world, it also is killing her sons and Vision. I'm like, oh, okay, so here's the go-to play that ultimately eventually we're going to have Wanda be pulling the story of the man who has everything. And this is a Justice League episode, and I know this is Marvel, but I'm pulling from a DC thing. This is the man who has everything, where, like, we're going to have it to where Wanda had a perfect life in Westview, and ultimately for the man who has or the woman that has everything in this episode, she is eventually going to have to rip off her arm, metaphorically speaking, to get rid of the things that she loves the most, and then eventually go back into waking up into the real world or the normal world. Because she had this time in this bubble. So I'm like, immediately I'm like, oh, okay, so this is like, nothing about this feels original. Like, nothing about, I'm like, immediately when I saw like Vision and Wiccan and Speed ultimately starting to crumble, I'm like, oh, okay. So, man who has everything. Because ultimately we had Superman who ultimately had a birthday gift that made him go and have a coma-like dream uh, where Krypton was still a planet, and ultimately everyone had survived, and Kal-El had stayed on Krypton and ultimately had a wife and a kid and everything. And then we end up having it to where Kal-El had to realize that all this stuff wasn't real, and so he had to give that all up. So it's basically the exact same thing going on in this episode. So we end up having it to where eventually, so it seems that Scarlet Witch is getting weaker by every time she is using her power, because using this bubble for a long time and ultimately just doing all kinds of numerous other things. So we end up having it to where seemingly Scarlet Witch is consistently getting weaker and Agatha is getting stronger. Eventually, we have it to where Scarlet and Agatha end up fighting out for realsies. We end up having it to where Scarlet ends up using the origin story of Agatha to try and quite possibly take her down, but it ends up kind of doing a almost quasi reverse effect. So we end up having it to where Scarlet goes back into Agatha's backstory scene where there's witches and that were going to burn Agatha at the stake. And we ultimately have it to where Scarlet brings every single one of these witches back alive in an almost zombie-ish like state to have Agatha supposedly go back to being burnt at the stake. But we end up having it to where eventually that Agatha ends up spinning this whole thing to eventually have it to where Scarlet is on the stake, almost getting burnt alive, but we never get that far. We ultimately have it to where Scarlet Witch is starting to come into her own with her seemingly powers, really showcasing that she's starting to get the helmet emblem that Scarlet Witch is mostly known for. And so we eventually have it to where you can kind of see the little indent on Scarlet Witch's head of this helmet. And we ultimately have it to where Scarlet eventually pushes away all these witches and pushes away this flashback to go back into current time. So we eventually have it to where we have this flight up in the air. We end up having it to where Vision ends up trying to go and help Wanda, but Wanda ends up blocking Vision from the fight, and ultimately Vision's like, Wanda, why can't I help you? But too bad, so sad, I guess. So we end up having it to where we have Hulk movie moment, where ultimately we find out that Agatha wants to drain Scarlet seemingly of all of her power, and it seems that everything is working. That ultimately, like, Wanda is pulling the Hulk maneuver where it's like, take it all kind of thing. And so ultimately we have it to where Scarlet is seemingly very drained, almost skeleton skinned like, and she is just floating in air. So I'm like, so wait a minute, she has absolutely no power. All of her power is drained, but she's powerful enough to be repetitiously floating in midair. Wouldn't she have fell at this point? Just my thought. So that's why this scene does not work. Because when looking at it, I'm like, well, Scarlet is still floating in air, so this means that Scarlet is not going to have lost all of her power. There has to be some kind of take it all moment where Agatha is going to get beat in reverse. Immediately, that's what I was thinking. I'm like, well, she's floating in air, so this isn't over. Agatha isn't going to win. And besides that, this is basically Wanda's show, and Wanda has already been said that she is going to go and be on another movie, be on another show, be on any number of other things. So, yeah, I'm not buying that Wanda is going to get defeated. Kind of like basically telling us already that Wanda is going to be in other projects basically ruins the end of this show for anybody. It's basically to tell us that Wanda is just going to become stronger at some point. It's kind of obvious. So, we end up finding the whole time that the siphoning off of Wanda's power to go into Agatha, I think, looked like the powers were going into Agatha, but it was actually all in reverse. We end up having it to where Wanda had probably been siphoning off of Agatha's power, and there is a whole thing about like cosmic power and like cosmic magic and stuff like that, which ultimately is really deep involved into Wanda's Rolodex of things. When ultimately they said like cosmic magic, I was like, oh, okay, so they're really dipping into the comic books for these sayings and stuff along those lines. So we end up finding out that Agatha is starting to get all crispy and crackly and whatever. And so that is to tell us that, okay, well, Wanda took all of Agatha's power, and we just start to see all these bizarre sigils or like little symbols in the air, which I'm not 100% familiar with what those all actually are. They must be some kind of incantation or spell-esh like thing. And so we ultimately have it to where Agatha is now beaten, and so now we take this fight back to the ground, where we end up having it to where Scarlet has now changed into her, I guess, comic book familiar territory costume. And so now we have it to where Wanda is going to make Agatha Agnes again, the nosy neighbor, and change her back into the Westview woman that she had been. Basically saying that, yeah, I'm going to torture you for the rest of your life by putting you back into your role and forcing you to play this role for the rest of your life. We ultimately seemingly find out also, and I want to get back to this. So we ultimately find that seemingly Spectrum ultimately had opened up this basement to ultimately have it to where Quicksilver was there, and ultimately he was saying something like snitches get stitches or something like that, or something along those lines, where it's like peepers get keepers, or I don't know, some bizarre thing that he ended up saying. We end up having it to where we find out that supposedly Pedro is still Pedro, but then we also find out that Pedro is also some actor. So I'm like, wait a minute, so what? So this Quicksilver isn't actually the legitimate Quicksilver. And so I'm kind of baffled about that. I was like, okay, so are we just led to believe that Quicksilver was ultimately whoever Scarlet Witch wanted him to be? So keeping the continuity of this all, of just that Wanda had casted this Quicksilver to be into this show, so it kind of keeps continuity that their Quicksilver in Age of Ultron was actually the actual Quicksilver, and Westview is just going to just resolve that Quicksilver character once Wanda eventually resolves Westview, I would have assessed. So eventually we have it uh, to where Spectrum ultimately takes out Quicksilver and makes her way out to help out the boys, because we find out that while Wanda was taking out Agatha all along, and Vision was taking out Vision White, we end up having it to where uh, Vision and Wanda tell their sons, "Hey, like we ultimately never really prepared you for this, but you were born to do this." So we end up having it to where Wiccan and Speed end up taking out all of the uh, Agents of Sword people by basically just getting rid of all of their guns and ultimately making it that whenever they were to fire on anybody, that Wiccan would just use his power to ultimately just stop all their bullets. To where ultimately Spectrum also tried to stop some of the bullets of the uh, Agents of Sword like people. We also have Darcy, who takes out Agent Haywire or Hayward, out with her vehicle. Ultimately says, "You're going to jail." I'm like, okay, sure. Because ultimately we have to resolve everything, and we ultimately have to say that Darcy took 12 years to get here, to ultimately just be like, yeah, you're going to jail. So that's her whoop-de-doo line. We ultimately have it to where the other agent, I think his name is Wu, ultimately goes and calls somebody and ultimately mentions like, "Hey, can you be here within the hour?" Ultimately to showcase that it's like, okay, is that going to be the Doctor of Strange? Is that going to be Captain Marvel? Is that going to be some big force? Not so much. So we end up having it to where Wanda ends up taking Agatha and changing her into the role of which that she wants her to play. And so we end up having it to where Wanda ultimately takes her sons and her Vision back home to eventually realize that they are going to all have to say goodbye to one another. Ultimately having it to where the Westview is kind of condensing and uh, and ultimately going into changing everything back to its normal state. So we end up having it to where Wanda ends up having to go and say goodbye to her sons, and then eventually she ends up having to, of course, say goodbye to Vision. And so after that, we end up having it to where Wanda ends up going and is now in a home that no longer exists. She is back to a home that seems to have been uh, showcased previously before when she started this whole thing off. And I'm like, wait a minute. So is this going to be that like Wanda was in this environment this whole entire time and none of this ever happened? Like, are we going to go back to like ultimately just saying like, oh, this was just in uh, Scarlett's head the entire time of playing this whole scenario out? Are they going to do that and it'll be like, oh yeah, this show was just an entire waste of time, and that would have really ticked me off. But no, we end up having it to her reasonably. So Wanda ends up going out and greeting Spectrum to ultimately say her goodbyes to Spectrum, and we end up having it uh, to where Rambeau ends up meeting Wu, who is now the commanding officer, and telling people what all to do. And we ultimately have it to where there seems to be a detective that is ultimately going to take Rambeau to this theater, which I'm like, okay, so we're ultimately going to have some big character show up here, right? Or is there just going to be another just swerve to ultimately tell us that no? Sure, far enough. So we end up going to this theater, and Rambo is looking at the screen, and she ends up turning around. And so the detective turns into a scroll and ultimately just says, like, hey, yeah, just letting you know, like, we have some important people that you need to talk to. And I'm like, oh, okay, so in other words, Spectrum is going to just be tied to S.H.I.E.L.D. or go and possibly go with doing some Captain Marvel stuff, I'm assuming, in some other movie. This character is going to be relevant, and in the future, they will make her so relevant. So now we have it. So Scarlet ultimately is to have everything go away. She lost Vision again. She had to say goodbye to her sons because ultimately her sons weren't real. And I'm like, okay, so we wasted time with investing in these sons to ultimately not have them be a thing anymore. Wow, that sucks. But then also we're gonna have a alternate Vision, and so we're not gonna actually have that Vision. We're gonna have another Vision that's gonna be involved in here because I'm assuming that is what's going to happen. Is Vision is going to come back because that basically is what is going to happen. So ultimately we have it to where the very last cutscene is Wanda in some cabin somewhere, to where we are to believe that Wanda is ultimately going and like putting a pot kettle or something like that, putting something on. But then eventually we find out uh, in her actual bedroom, we end up seeing her astral projecting, I think like Doctor Strange did, and is now consistently cover to cover reading that book that ultimately was the Book of the Damned, where ultimately we find out that seemingly Wanda is ultimately getting more and more powerful, we are to assess or to assume. And we ultimately have it to where Wanda is hearing the echoes of her sons, and I would assess that she's probably going to use the Book of the Damned to probably get back her sons, quite possibly, or to also get back her vision, like basically having a spirit swapping maneuver with uh, the Vision she loved and the white Vision that ultimately is just like a blank slated Vision with memories of whatever Vision had of whatever. But yeah, that's it with this that's what's it with this show. There's no big, oh my god, is Captain Marvel gonna be in here? Is Doctor Strange? Is he gonna be on the last episode? I guess I should have probably checked IMDb because IMDb tells you every single person that's going to be on the show, and Doctor Strange was not one of them. But I was like, but man, there's got to be some big spoiler thing that ultimately they just could not, like, nobody could figure it out. Nobody could IMDb this and figure it out. No nothing, no whatever. Like, I think at some point Doctor Strange was mentioning that he was going to, like, Benedict Cumberbatch on one of his social medias was mentioning that he was going to be on this show at with some capacity. I guess that was a lie. And then also I think that they had to, like, ultimately back out of that to just say it's like, well, maybe he'll be tied onto the show and maybe he won't. And then like, I'm like, basically that's when people should be dead silent about things because people are going to be in an uproar because people are going to be like, well, I thought Doctor Strange was going to be on the show. I thought Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man was going to be bizarrely on the show. I thought Captain Marvel was going to be on the very tail end of this show. Told me have some kind of transition from WandaVision to whatever next project that she's going to be into, because everybody was way more excited about that than whatever this show was. And ultimately, like, that is all that I have to say about this show. Is it just like basically from episode 1 to this very last episode, none of this was worth watching. None of this had a big, like, none of this had a big, like, tail end moment where you're like, oh my god, wow. Because ultimately, all of this to me was, like, hands down too predictable. Every little bit of it was like, oh, we could be surprised about this. But then I'm like, no, I haven't been surprised about this entire show. And I didn't like any portion of this entire show. And so immediately I'm like, oh, okay, well, like, so this last episode was, like, predictable to a T. As soon as I realized that there was going to be a ninth episode, I was like, oh, okay, so we're basically just gonna have like an entire episode that it's gonna be like one big or barely big battle and then conclusion. So yeah, that very uneventful series finale. I can't wait till any other show but this to be out. So let's go on to ultimately see where WandaVision is going to show up next in the MCU, if they're ever going to even have an MCU at this point, because Black Widow still hasn't been out yet. And so recently, like, Black Widow is now haltered, so that means any number of other projects are probably still going to be haltered. We're probably not going to see any of these Marvel releases until what, 2023. So vaccine and all kinds of other things be danged, because supposedly we're supposed to be getting Black Widow to supposedly be out in May, but I am not going to say that that is a certainty. They can ultimately put a trailer out. They can ultimately say it's going to be released on that day. I don't buy it. So, yeah. So, this is just what we're going to have for the MCU for now. And then ultimately, that's all we'll have. So, yeah, ultimately it's just better for me to just, like, ultimately I'm watching Legion right now. I'm watching Legion because ultimately I'm like, yeah, I never finished that show, and so now I'm going to take the time to, like, finish that show so I can actually have a Marvel adjacent show that ultimately doesn't exactly have a tie to the MCU, but it just is a superhero show that I can watch, that I was kind of interested about. So I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.